Hello, and welcome to our webinar on the state of enterprise AI. My name is Kuftic. I'm a product manager here with Expedient, and last week I got the chance to sit down with our Senior Vice President of AI, Brad Reynolds, to discuss the state of enterprise AI and how your organization can better strategize going into 2024. After the discussion, Brad and I will be available for a Q&A so we can answer your specific questions around your organization and how you're looking at AI going forward. And with that, we'll head over to the discussion. Hi, I'm here today with Brad Reynolds. He is our SVP of AI. And Brad, thanks for joining me today.
Thanks for having me, AJ.
Just out of curiosity, you're our new SVP of AI. Kind of give me a background on how you got into AI, what you've done so far, and kind of walk me through that.
Yeah, so I mean, taking it way back, I've been a serial entrepreneur. I started and sold a bunch of technology companies. One of them was Expedient, was the original CEO and founder. But I always like being on the forefront of whatever the newest, latest, greatest technology is. And at the early stage, that was the internet. And for the last 2 years, I've been doing consulting on AI.
Okay.
And by consulting, I mean doing a lot of strategy conversations, but also implementing use cases and proof of concept. So actually coding and getting servers deployed and all that type of stuff. So I ended up doing some consulting work with Expedient, and it turned into a business case, and the business case turned very compelling. And so I decided to come on board as the SVP of AI and kind of apply what I learned in the consulting world to building out product for Expedient.
And then kind of when you're out there, you're talking to these various companies, where do you see them right now in terms of an enterprise level AI?
Yeah, I maybe even take a step back from that. One of the unique things about this technology is that my conversations are happening at the board and the CEO level. So usually in technology, a new tech comes out, the developers are figuring it out, and it kind of works its way up the chain. And so that's completely flipped, which
Okay.
I think is an indicator of how important folks think AI could be, but nobody's implementing it yet. They're thinking about it, maybe trialing things, but there's a lot of strategy discussion. So from the consulting side before, I was going through 5 steps of building like a 2024 AI strategy. Actually, we've done a webinar on that to kind of walk you through that process.
You should check that out.
Yeah, check it out. But once you have some sort of a strategy, now you're in the spot to start to think about how to implement it. And so what comes out of most of those strategy conversations with mid to large size enterprises is we want to harness the power of what we see in ChatGPT, this revolution of we can talk to data in English and have a conversation with it. Novel. How do we do that responsibly within our data governance guidelines inside of our company? That's where a huge gap of work is. And so when we use a term enterprise AI, that's kind of to differentiate it from a lot of the AI hype conversation. So a lot of the consumer AI, you hear terms called generative AI, but we're thinking enterprise AI is the right kind of structure and term because it means using AI responsibly inside of an organization. And there's a lot of different ways that you can do that, but you're putting your corporate hat on and saying, how does this work in my infrastructure?
And I think that's kind of the thing that we've seen. We've seen machine learning and AI and generative AI and all of these individual terms come out, but a lot of them are so incredibly generic that, at least from my experience, I've noticed a lot of people who 2 years ago would have said automated are now saying AI, and they're just kind of like finding and replacing that term. When we're talking about AI, this is going deeper than that.
Yeah, I think there's a notion that is AI just a marketing hype that every brand puts on whatever their product is or whatever initiative that they're doing. And the reality is there's something deeper there. And what is AI good at? It's good at finding needles in haystacks, taking large amounts of data and identifying where a pattern or a problem could be. And so the AI conversation has evolved from, actually it's evolved in a couple of ways. The older AI, we'll say prior to ChatGPT in November of last year, was very scientific. It was data scientists and machine learners building their own AI models from scratch and applying them to medical use cases, readmittance and all that type of stuff. So it was really the domain of scientists and PhDs. And since then, it's evolved into the domain of engineers and now business people, because the driver for AI now is, how do I solve business problems with this technology? Is it real, and can it deliver substantial value? And I've seen in consulting that it can. There's a lot of things you need to consider to figure out how it can for your business, but it's real. There's no hype to this thing.
And from when we're talking about AI, there's a lot of different terms that exist: tuning, fine-tuning, inference. I think that's where a lot of people start to get into the actual technology of it. But I think there's still some business angle to that, of understanding what that really means outside of the technology debate.
Yeah, so one of the dangers of AI is you can easily get down a technical rabbit hole with a lot of this stuff. And if you're reading stuff online, you're going to hear a ton of terms. And some of those terms might actually mean the same thing. And so it's hard to navigate through that information. But in terms of some of those things that you mentioned, like tuning and training and fine-tuning and inference, there's kind of two schools in AI right now. One side is the folks that are building models to do things. So essentially, they're building brains. So an example of this would be GPT-4 is a model that OpenAI built that you interface to through ChatGPT, and it answers lots of questions, PhD level in so many areas. That process of building that model from scratch is hugely resource intensive. Farms and farms of GPUs, millions and millions of dollars, and it requires hard science, really deep stuff. On the other side, so that would be training. On the other side, we're talking inference. So if you think of inference, all it means is, what's the steady state operation of that model that's been trained? So you did all this training, and now we're going to run this model for 3 years, or in the case of GPT, since last year. And that's a steady state. So it's a much lower workload, but you're essentially asking it questions, and it's running, maybe in the past you think about it like a virtual machine, a big piece of software that's constantly running, ready to answer questions. But you're not training it. It's set in whatever it was trained for. And an analogy that I heard that I particularly liked is, and why it's applicable to enterprises, is how long did it take a person to learn to walk? Usually a year and a half. Yep. How long have they walked in life? 50, 60, 70, 80 years. The walking part is inference, like how long you're going to use these models. The training part is the prior to learning to walk. And so that's kind of how it divides out in terms of some of those terms. And then the third one that you mentioned was fine tuning. What that means is you take a model and customize it to something relevant to your use case. So if you're a business and you have a coding model, you can train that coding model on your specific code, so it gets a little smarter and reacts the same way that one of your coders would versus a coder from another corporation. So the fine-tuning aspect happens a little further down the pike, but it's a lot less resource intensive than
because you're taking something that's existing and focusing it down to a specific use case versus trying to build it all from the very beginning.
Yeah, think about it like you're taking someone with a master's degree and giving them a PhD. It doesn't take that long amount of time relative to their whole educational career. It kind of works that way.
So when we start to talk about, moving from this, what is the concepts, into an AI strategy, kind of what are the steps there? Because I think you can't get to implementation before you get to your strategy. So when we talk through a strategy, what are those typical areas that AI strategy should cover?
Yeah, so if you're starting at ground zero, like there's power here, but we need to figure out how it applies to your enterprise, you start with setting the stage. So setting the stage is, you need to figure out, how is the board involved in this? How is the C-level involved in this? Who's going to own this inside of the company? what kind of AI policies can you put in place so that as you're experimenting and learning, and we're all experimenting and learning, that it's done in a responsible fashion? Because you're not going to get to step 4 if you don't start experimenting. How do you do that responsibly? That's kind of the first step of the game. The next steps are generally around data. So we talk a lot in the story about these AI brains and how they process information, and they can write marketing copy, they can code for you. But for an enterprise, different from a consumer, one of the really important parts is you have a huge amount of structured and unstructured data inside of your company that's proprietary. How do you take that brain and marry it to that data so that it speaks about what's relevant to your company and not in generalities like ChatGPT would? And that notion says that AI and data, it's really one story that's tightly coupled. And so now it's like, okay, I need to access our ticketing system data, or I need to access our technical documentation drive, or things like that. Now you need to understand, how do I get that data in the right spot? How do I ingest it into, we'll say, a vector data store or some sort of presentation system for the AI? How do I keep it up to date? Is some of that data customer proprietary and confidential? Is others generally open? What if accounting needs access to it versus a technician? Lot of interesting conversations that need to happen inside of your company about getting data in the right spot, presenting it the right way, having the right authorization and access. If you have that part of the story figured out kind of sequentially, now you can deploy AI proof of concepts, but you got to figure out which ones work. And so one of the learning lessons we've had at Expedient is we have ideas about interesting transformative proof of concepts, but they're novel to the organization. One of the things that Brian Smith, our CEO, and others at the executive team had done is they said, okay, we grasp what AI can do. We grasp the pattern recognition capability. We understand we have a bunch of data. What are things that are already in flight in terms of objectives and key results for our company that we could plug AI into? Might not be transformative, but might be accelerative. And the important thing with that is that it will deliver on something we had already kind of committed to as an organization, and it will get buy-in from the rest of the company that AI isn't the next blockchain or flash in the pan hype technology. Oh, it's improved these 5 things we've been working on for a quarter or a year. And I think that hooking that into kind of your existing enterprise goals is a really good starting place for a proof of concept. As one, I think you should also play with experimental proof of concepts. Things like, I want to have a chat bot that our customer service agents can go and ask of the data store. Didn't exist before, could unlock a lot of value, but you're introducing a new process and procedure into the organization, which just from a dynamics perspective is always fraught with issues of getting rollout, getting buy-in, getting acceptance. And so kind of having that two-edged spot. Once you get some POCs, now you're thinking for the long term, which is, okay, we've had some of those experiments going, but how do we make sure that this, as it scales out, keeps protecting our data? Potentially, we want to keep it all private. We never want anything going outside of our walls because it's sensitive. And so you got to kind of think for the next 10 years, 5 years of, where could this go? And do I have the right pieces and infrastructure in place to get it there?
You know what's interesting is that this all sounds very similar to what we've been talking about with cloud for the last decade. All of the people who wanted to run out in 2010, we're going to go all in on cloud, and then finding out that just treating it as a technology and not as a business transformer is, and without any sort of use case, creates issues. Like you're saying, when people are just running out and just slapping data out into any sort of public AI platform, you're potentially introducing some lovely legal ramifications of this data was breached or this data was leaked. So when we talk about enterprise AI, kind of how does that fit in from a policy standpoint? You mentioned the guardrails, but kind of talk through like what a good policy would look like.
Yeah, so a lot of times this will come out of both legal and the CIO perspective. And in the success packet that we're going to be giving everybody at the end of this webinar, they'll have some examples of AI policy that they could use for their organization that covers all kinds of different use cases. But the reality with it is you start first at the business case. What business drivers are we trying to solve?
Right.
Okay, and then you say that has a decent magnitude, and you go back down and say, okay, and then to solve those business drivers, what type of data do we need? How restrictive do we need to be about that data? If we access the ticket system and it has customer information, okay, that could be priority 2 data. That must stay private.
Correct.
It can never go out to the open internet. We might say, hey, this is data that our customer service reps have typed, but doesn't have any customer information. There could still be PII around it, but we're okay with that. A CIO would make that distinction, or a legal person. We're okay with it going out to the open internet for an AI engine, but we want to redact all the PII out of it. There could be other data like, hey, write some marketing copy for a webinar that we're going to do. And that might be, we don't care about redacting. That data is not as important.
There's no personally identifiable information in it.
And so you figure out those kind of layers, and it is important in those use cases of business drivers that you kind of classify what that is, and then you pick the appropriate spot. So the most restrictive, do it all private. It never leaves your walls. It could be in your co-location. It could be at your office location. And then you go down there, and then you have kind of grades of restriction past that. But just be aware, once it leaves your walls and it's in plain text and you see the content of the chat, who knows what could happen to it. And you need to understand that, be responsible steward for your client's data and your own as well.
And when we kind of talk through that stewardship, there's kind of a people and time and process and technology and money, honestly, that goes into that. So how do you set those business requirements for building a team and a budget around an AI POC that you want to run inside your business?
Yeah, so I can give some insight into how Expedient did it, but I think the first step is do a go, no go. Is this something in 2024, whenever you kind of assess it, do we want to invest in this? And then if we invest in it, kind of what general magnitude are we interested in? If this is a pure alpha experiment, it might be $500,000 or $1 million. If it's something you see as having huge impact the next year, might be up in the millions. But figure that out. There has to be a budget. This isn't just have a couple developers go experiment with some things and try and do it on a shoestring. It's relatively expensive, but it drives a lot of value on the other side. Just kind of, so figure out that around the business use cases and POCs. What we did at Expedient is we kind of created a business unit or an entity within an entity. Because Expedient, being the founder and CEO 25 years ago, there's 25 years of a stable infrastructure company with very solid processes, and everything's worked out very well there. AI, we're all learning about. It's experimental. It's like a startup. It's a startup for everybody, whether it's us or another enterprise. And it needs to be treated in a different way, but it has a different motion. And so for us, it was building that bubble where we could interact with the company, but also do our experiments without affecting the rest of the company. And so there's a line of demarcation. But the other thing that we did that might be helpful to enterprises is, for the folks that are working for that team, they actually sit in functional units under other people inside of the company. So they're part of the AI team, but they might sit in the marketing department. They might sit with the principal technologist. And as the products evolve, all of that information gets disseminated throughout the organization, which I think is a pretty kind of key component. The other part of it is you need folks fully dedicated to it. Everyone's busy. Everything, there's lots of email. Keeping up with an inbox is a real task these days. And with the pace at which AI is changing, if you're not spending a couple hours a day reading about what's going on, you will not be able to stay abreast of it. And most folks already have full-time jobs. So how are you going to spend 2 hours and then additional research and development if you're trying to straddle multiple responsibilities? It's not going to work for everybody because you're trying to keep things within a budget, but if you can even have one person that's dedicated to AI, maybe some partial people outside, it'll pay off really well from an enterprise perspective.
And I think that's where Expedient overall can help in terms of from your IT side, from the infrastructure side, using our services for your existing infrastructure so that you can free up that time to focus, as you're saying, and be a more dedicated person if you want to go build an AI policy structure and an enterprise AI platform for your organization. What are the common POCs and the technical considerations? Kind of saying, okay, these people have time now. What would they be working on? What do you see as the more common proof of concepts there?
Yeah, so the highest leverage use case in terms of the amount of time you have to invest, the amount of output and value you get, tends to be around code development. And what it is you want your coders to have an assistant, or a co-pilot would be a term other people use, so that as they're developing code, it can auto-complete things for them, it can help them with different functional areas. And what those folks do is they either can use a chatbot to interact with, like a ChatGPT or others, or there's actual interfaces from a coding IDE environment so that directly in the method that they're using to code, it's auto-completing things on the fly. They're not entering some sort of a separate interface. Those things you can get up in, if you use an infrastructure provider like Expedient in like a day. So, or you can go out and buy the $20 a month GitHub Copilot or things like that. That's an easy start. And you can figure out what the economics of that are for an organization. But that's like a quick use case. And there's a variety of other applications there. Another typical use case is when you go inside of a customer support department and you want to improve the quality of your customer support output. So a really simple use case would be if you have a trouble tracking system, before a ticket is closed, you send the content of that full ticket, customer and response and client service, to an AI and say, did we answer everything that this client needed?
That's really interesting.
Yeah, and it's not phenomenally difficult to do, but it results in a much higher quality experience. Now, the AI isn't answering things to the client, it's just surfacing it to a professional to say, you might have missed step 3, or step 3 wasn't as clear as you could have wanted it to be, and maybe think about clarifying it. They could still submit it out and say, nah, I think I had everything, but it gave a little bit of feedback loop to a human. So between customer service and coding, those are good use cases to start on, other than anything that's already in flight at your company that happens to be data-oriented or big data-oriented. You'd be like, oh, we could speed that up with AI. Those are great use cases, but they're going to be real specific to a certain, any particular entity.
So you brought up data, and we've talked a bit here about the importance of the data. But when it comes to AI and the way that we see data being handled, how are companies' existing data structures enabling or blocking adoption for AI?
Yeah, so if you think about it in terms of, we'll say, large language models, so like the things like GPT-4, the reasoning engines that you can talk to in English, they need to interact with data in a specific format. It's called a vector format, and it's in a vector database. Great, that's novel. Most people don't have a vector database.
Yeah, I've checked my list. I don't have any.
Yeah. So if you think about it, that's the point at which a pipeline is built to the AI. So if you don't have a vector database, you need to figure out how to collect the data and transform it in a way that goes into the vector data store. So real simple example would be you have a file store or multiple file stores of different departments, the marketing department, technical documentation, accounting information. They're all stored all over. They somehow have to get pulled in and pushed into a vector data store with an embeddings engine. There's all kinds of technical requirements. When you think about it, we're talking in English, so we're talking to text. And so you have documents in all kinds of formats. What do you do with images? How do you handle a PDF that has a table inside of it? What chunks do you chunk things out in, which is just a more of a vector store type thing. There's a lot under the hood. How do you govern the data? Who should have access to it? How do you make sure accounting can't ask a question of a sales team that they shouldn't have access to, or a technician ask an accounting question on payroll? Those are things that have to be figured out. So it's one thing to get the data there, but it's another thing to say who has access to what and make sure that's tightly coupled, logged, authorized, all that type of stuff.
And I think that classification part is really important. That's a large enterprise concern, because you and I going to ChatGPT and saying, hey, write me a for loop in Python, that's pretty straightforward. It's taking publicly available, blog posts on how to do that and just summarizing it into plain text English with some code. But if I say, hey, I show me Brad's salary, I don't have rights to see that. I'm not your manager. I shouldn't be able to see that data. So how can companies classify that data and govern that data? Is that a easy thing to do, or is that something that's a really difficult thing?
I think we'll go back to a notion that I think it was Cisco that popularized a thing called AAA, so accounting, authorization, and access. And if you look at it from, like, for our use case of, we use Active Directory as a company, so that's all of your login information, but it also has your roles. So your role might be in the technology group, I'm in the AI group, the marketing folks are in the marketing group, but all of that information is inherited when you access the system. If you go into ChatGPT, you're just logging in as somebody under a corporation, but it doesn't necessarily know the nuance of what does that mean? Who reports to who? That's in Active Directory. So if you start there, and I think that's a very important place for enterprises to start, now you're looking at accounting. So accounting meaning, let's log this responsibly. But then I think what you were getting at is more the authorization.
Right.
So, okay, these roles are able to access this particular data. So you would need to make sure on the data side that that marketing set of documents, who should have access when we ingest that, and then putting that kind of matchup between the AI front end and the data store back end to say, aha, we have a match, therefore this data should be accessible. It takes a couple of steps, and there's some new technologies involved with vector stores. And does your vector store natively understand what your Active Directory stands, and how do you pick the right one? I mean, that's where you either have folks on staff or you have folks at your providers that can help you with that. But it's very difficult to just say, go figure it out on your own right now.
And I think that's we're bringing a lot of sort of traditional IT constructs, just role-based access control. That's been a thing for 2 decades plus now, of how do we handle who should and who does have access to which pieces of data or applications or whatever, and trying to apply those to AI because of what that does for the organization. It protects and puts those guardrails into place. How important, beyond just the data and the classifications, just where it is? Because I think there's a lot of organizations that over the last probably decade or so have built data strategies around, I have this compliance need to hold this data for 7 years. I don't access it ever, so it can go into some really cold storage. Or this is my production data that I use every single day. It needs to be on my super fast hot storage. How does that data strategy play into AI?
Yeah, I think that you start from the use cases and the data that you want, and then you kind of work your way down to, okay, the open gap is, we know we need the data presented in this format in a vector data store, and we know the data lives in these 20 locations with different kind of policies. How do we merge those together? Do we have a data lake or data warehouse or something that's the AI prep store, so we can kind of write pipelines and ETLs and those types of things to get everything there on a regular basis? But you also are be asking yourself with, great, we can't do that once. So the data in the marketing repository has changed. How do we flow that through the system? And there's technologies to do that. Like Expedient, we've curated technologies to help with that process. You can write things yourself to do it, but it's like a lot of that has to be accurate. one of the advantages with the using an internal data store, a vector data store, is you can have up-to-date company information. These models, whatever you use, whether you're using an outside model from OpenAI or you have a private model of your own, they're trained as of a specific time, so as of 2022 or 2023, but you want up-to-date data. And so you need to know that when you're querying it, it is up-to-date and synchronized at all times. And you need a set of technologies that you've curated to kind of take it from where it naturally lives, where it works for the people in your business, getting it into the point that it could be presented to AI. And there's a gap there, and everybody's gaps will be different. Look at it, figure out where we can deploy some technology and make that a smooth pipeline.
And so as we kind of, as you mentioned, going forward, all these models are very point in time. How do you future-proof that platform? How do you get to a point where not only you made it work for the POC, you made it work for that initial use case, but as you go forward and build more use cases, how do you make sure that your infrastructure and platform are future-proofed around that?
Yeah, I mean, it's a very difficult question because with AI changing so quickly, it's hard to feel like you have a grasp of what the future is going to be. But there's a couple of things that I've seen, and one of them is around the model. And the model, like we explained, was what's behind ChatGPT is GPT-4, but there's also open source models. So think of it the same way you might think of Linux as a software program. Those models are getting minted out every single day. There'll be new versions of models. And I know that they're changing so fast and improving so much that you can't build your infrastructure around model version 2.1. Because 2.3 could be transformative to your company. So as you're thinking from an architectural perspective, you need to craft it so that you can forklift a model in and out. And this notion of models is novel. People just think, oh, it's the AI. You might have 50 models inside of your company, one that speaks code, one that speaks Python code, one that speaks SQL, one that speaks accounting, one that speaks to customer service, and one that's a general purpose model. And you're going to be managing those like version control or outsourcing it to a provider like us who takes care of all of that kind of model building and curation for you. But the notion is AI is improving significantly on a weekly basis. So you want to make sure that you can use the latest and greatest whenever it comes out. And if you have 50 models, 2 latest and greatest ones might come out in places 35 and 48. Pull those out and put the new ones in. So make sure the architecture is capable of evolving with AI so that you're not using a 10-year-old car when you could be using a Tesla.
And so kind of to wrap this up, I thank you so much for all the time that we actually put together here. How do you see this going forward for enterprise AI in 2024? I think that's a kind of key next step.
Yeah, so it's pretty simple. If you don't have a strategy and plan, work there. Don't worry so much about the exactly what the POCs are and all that kind of stuff. Let's get a plan together, and that plan will tell you what type of data you might need, what POCs could be possible, and it also will get you comfortable around where does your organization fall on the private versus public scale? Like, there are solutions. If you want to be completely private, there is a solution for you. So it's not that you have to turn AI off, but everybody's at a different spot in that continuum. After you establish that, in the words of Nike, just do it. You got to start doing this. It is experimental. It is early stage. It's very entrepreneurial. And so start trying POCs. So if you can get a couple of POCs accomplished that hopefully relate to a business goal that you already had and improve that or a novel goal, and you look at the end of 2024 as like, hey, we learned all of these things. We built these policies. We made all of these mistakes, and we've implemented a few POCs. You'll be well ahead of the game in the enterprise sphere.
I really want to thank Brad for his time. We are now going to go to question and answer time. Hello, everyone. Welcome to the question and answer segment. Brad is with me. Thank you, Brad, for taking an additional portion of time out of your day to kind of walk through some questions. I also want to thank everybody who filled during the registration. You guys put in questions, which was very helpful. So we have some additional things to make sure that we hit on throughout this. Brad, I just wanted to make sure that I can hear you.
Yep, all good.
Okay, great. We're good. So we started talking about it in the actual, kind of discussion, but how are we using generative AI and AI in general, kind of flip that around, internally for Expedient to support customer business? And I think this is something that we've been working on for a while now, and kind of how are we taking it to that next level?
Yeah, so I mean, we're going to eat our own dog food with our product. And one of the aspects that we focused on is how do we make an impact across the organization as quickly as possible. We touched on it a little bit in the webinar as well. So we've actually created a product which we're using internally as a beta called AI Chat Control, which is a front end that abstracts all of the open chat softwares and then our own private models so that our employees have a chat front end, but it has the proper policies and governance on top of it. So for instance, our Active Directory's in it, logging and monitoring's in it, PI redaction's in it, and the ability to choose between models depending on the maybe sensitivity of the data. So, hey, private model for this, OpenAI is a possible model for that. So why that's important is because the first thing that we need to do as an organization is to teach everyone to use AI effectively, because the AI group only has so much knowledge about the domain of the organization. You need to get the power in the hands of the subject matter experts. So you'd be like, aha, this is a use case that is good for AI. How do we turn that type of copy paste use case into something that's operationalized? And so we all want to talk about use cases and transformation, but the real transformation is transforming each individual at a company into someone that's AI competent. And then some of them will bubble up into becoming AI experts. So that's like step one, is deploying some sort of chat software. We happen to have a product that does it that we're going to be launching in beta here at the end of the month, but there's other chat softwares. You got to get people using it so they get comfortable with what AI is capable of doing, and also what it's just not good at doing, before they start coming up with a bunch of use cases that are boondoggles. So that's the general sense. Now, when we take some of that knowledge that we've gained by broadening AI to everyone in our company, and I'll use the analogy that it's like giving all of your employees a gym membership, because by using our chatbot, we don't have to have 400 employees buying a chat service from an external party. We're saying, hey, it's open for you. We have policy guidelines and all of that, but try and use it in innovative ways for your job within that policy framework. What comes out of that is, hey, I wonder if we could create executive summaries for our tickets when we hand off on a shift change in customer support, so someone doesn't have to read through days and weeks worth of previous information. They can kind of get a running start. Well, that came out of our OSC. We took that, combined it with an AI backend, and now we have a ticket summary piece. We have a root cause analysis piece. So if something's happened, it's affected a bunch of customers. How do we get a really coherent root cause analysis together to get to clients quickly? Say, hey, here's what happened. Here's how we've remediated it. Here's how we're going to prevent it in the future. Seems like a simple thing to talk about, but actually takes hours and hours of work. It needs to be highly accurate before it goes out. So AI didn't completely solve that problem, but it was able to generate root cause analyses that were needed maybe 5% human tweaking at the end. Another use case that came out of the OSC is, hey, could we take a customer and take a look at their history in the last, say, 6 months of tickets and gauge their satisfaction? Tell us why they're happy, low, medium, high. How satisfied are they? Are there areas that we can work on? Typical things that you would use on one side in a sales fashion on like a quarterly business review, but on the other side on a support fashion in terms of, we should be aware of these things. This customer is not that satisfied. We need to make some extra effort. To paw through like 50 tickets or something over the course of 6 months, it's impossible for a human to do it. And even if you get part of it, you're not going to get the whole impression. You might have missed a piece over here or over there. That's what AI is great at, is finding and distilling that out of a large amount of data. And then another application in sales is, hey, if we have an initial conversation with a client, we have back-end systems like Salesforce that have also back-end systems in marketing like Sixth Sense that tell us a lot about that prospect. And so we can create a button that integrates Salesforce data, integrates Sixth Sense data, and integrates that into an AI so that when you're crafting the initial reach out, it's based on actual data that we have about them. So we don't send it directly out to a client, but we surface that up to a sales rep, say, here's some great things you can talk about. Here's what they seem to be interested in. Use your brain as a human to improve that. But man, as a starting point, it gets you like 80% of the way there. And those are just a few tangible use cases that came out. In this quarter, we're probably going to have 50 of them. And each individual one doesn't necessarily move the needle in a material way for the company, but in aggregate, they're showing the company that, hey, this is how AI is applied in action. And if you have ideas, you can take your ideas from your mind to manually testing to some sort of an implementation and tool set.
And I think this is something that we have more or less democratized it internally of this is something we want to go do. We also want to understand that as we're trying to build products, what are the use cases that we want to solve? Because if we want to solve them, probably likely that other people want to solve them too. So it allows us to help build solutions going forward. And it kind of brings us into that sort of concept of guardrails. So there was a question that came up that was, what big players are building guardrail solutions today that allows us to protect ourselves from preventing IP from being leaked? We need tools. And I can say that we're building some things. It's very nice of them to kind of set that up. But I think this is also something where a lot of people are looking at this going like, okay, I don't know that I can necessarily trust every one of these brand new companies that has just spun up into life. So kind of where do we see the larger organizations that are out there and how are they coming to the table with tools from a known entity that people trust?
Yeah. So if you're talking, say, like we'll call it public AI providers, I think that trust is something that's earned over a long period of time. So, well, I know that everybody knows that. And so you would be looking for people who might not have it completely figured out yet, but have a history of building applications for businesses. So this could be MSPs that you use, it could be AI providers, but they can put that enterprise hat on and they've delivered trusted data governed type solutions in the past. So, folks like a Kyndryl, folks like an Ahead, these are organizations that put on that hat. Folks like Microsoft, they do a great job at putting that business hat on. The larger the organization, so if you talk like a Microsoft or an Amazon, the problem is that they'll eventually get there, but it might take them a while to implement new changes or kind of react along the way. So that's something to kind of be considering of. But the reality of the AI stuff is the only one that you can really trust to build a guardrail is you. So if you find that the data that you have as an enterprise is super regulated and you have to pick a solution that doesn't necessarily involve them unless they can absolutely have it guaranteed, which is a tough thing to do. So like private models, private data stores, all of that type of stuff. So it's like a continuum situation, and you can so there's a variety of folks building them. A lot of stuff is nascent. Ours is relatively advanced, but everyone's still in the nascent phase. So the best protection and guardrail is just your own brain.
Yeah, I think this is where that sort of space of you need to know what's best for you right now. It's not there where it's like, okay, everybody's definitely doing this one thing. This is the one clean, true way to do it. Everybody's still trying to figure it out right now. So how do we make sure that there is a opportunity for you to make the right decision? And maybe that involves being slightly more conservative just to make sure that you're in the right place to act when the known, trusted, good way to do it comes out, especially for that sensitive data. And this kind of plays into the next question of like how to use AI in a secure and protected way. And we kind of talked about the tooling around that, but there's also the process that goes around that. and the policies that you need to put into place to actually make those work. So how do we actually make this more secure and protected going forward?
Yeah, so I think you have to define your use cases. So use case can be all the way down to marketing using a chat bot to do marketing stuff, blog post, image generation, all of that. So you're like, who are the people? Like, what are their roles and capabilities? And then what do they need access to? So, like in our chat beta solution, the notion of logging in with Active Directory naturally ties into the fact that I have a role, you have a role, HR has a role that feeds into the system. And you need to, whether you do it programmatically like we do in a chatbot, or you do it via policy, you have to define what roles have access to what information. You may already have that defined as part of a corporate policy. So I think getting that defined almost like on a piece of paper will let you build that into some sort of a system to say, hey, at our corporation, anyone with a support center login, they have access to our own internal knowledge base, but we don't want them to have access to any type of public model because we don't know all of the things we don't know yet. And for marketing, great. You can use our internal information, you can use our external information, but we're still going to monitor that for PII or sensitive info. So if you do accidentally type something in a public model, that it doesn't actually leak out to the public side of things. I also think on the part of AI where you might be accessing your internal data stores. So this would be ticketing systems, this could be HR systems, this could be financial systems, those types of things, that it's important that the application, whatever your application, so for us, it's a chatbot, never sees protected data. So don't hope that the application says, aha, I realize this is HR, let's filter it out. You need to think about at the data store level, having that same mapping of roles so that data doesn't actually ever come from the data store into the application, because there's always a chance the application can misbehave or be misconfigured and start to expose that information. That's more of a general data governance thing that's not super AI specific, but as people are using chatbots to access sensitive data, you need to be like have multiple barriers of sensitive information.
And I think you kind of touched on it. That was kind of key. It's like, okay, what is the role and what is the data that's on the back end? So if I want to say, hey, let's pull in all of this HR data, the only people who should have access to that type of data are the HR people, right? It shouldn't just be like, hey, this is magically available to everyone. I think this is also interesting in the term of like a private model where we've trained this model on our data. So if I'm using this model, it knows what our data looks like. If I use a general public model like the latest GPT-4 model, it doesn't know about that data because it's never been trained on it. So there is an option for private models to be a way for you to at least segment and keep your data away from a public or a non-secure location.
Yeah, I do want to, that's a good point. You can, in the most restrictive case, create like a walled garden. So private model, private data store, private application, and it's essentially just for your organization. That's not available at the Azure, the AWS, the OpenAI. It's a lot of shared access to the same model, but it's a more expensive and complicated solution. So you got to say, hey, is the value that I'm driving out of the system worth the fact that I really need to wall this garden off so that we can access it? And that's just, more of a dollars and cents kind of budgeting thing.
And I think for somebody like a health insurance company, they have that value. Like we cannot let this PII go out. That is our most critical data. This is what our members trust us with. So being able to say, we know that this is not leaving our four walls is really, really crucial. So I could see that being a value proposition. But if you're an organization that doesn't have that type of regulation or doesn't have that type of scrutiny, is it really worth the dollars to do that? Maybe, maybe not.
Mm-hmm.
There's the kind of the next sort of getting started. How do we get started with a small project on a small budget to gain credibility for a larger one? I think this is where sort of this is effectively how do we fund a POC? Right.
So I'd say this is a great way to think about it. I would, in fact, if you're trying to start with a large project, your probability of failure, think about it like angel investing in companies, high probability of failure with any one particular idea. But if you can start with a few small POCs, like maybe some of the ones that I talked about with our OSC, you want to show wins to generate momentum, to spin the flywheel more so that you can then justify some sort of return. In the early innings, and in a baseball analogy, my thought is we're in the top of the first batter, maybe second batter point. You have to maybe show time efficiency gains. So somebody's allocating funds to a project, they want to see some tangible result, other than, hey, AI is great, we love AI, and figuring out ways to make someone's life easier in your company, like we did with the ticket summarizers and client sentiment and the all of those things. That saves hours and hours and hours of work. And it's not fun work, it's tedious work. And so, okay, now that time can be spent elsewhere. Well, that time is a tangible factor. So if you think about small projects, I think the important part is which small project, and look at it in a calculus of how much time do I have to expend on it versus what is the time that I'm going to save in the organization. And if you find the ones where you don't have to spend much time and it saves a lot, that's your stack rank for the projects to work on. I will say, though, we'll just say a handful of AI projects, say you pick a handful of small AI projects, you should have a dedicated budget. And that budget can be time. So it could be like, hey, we're okay with you for the next 6 months allocating half of your time. Probably less than that would be tough because you get pulled in too many directions. We're okay with essentially spending that money or taking the opportunity cost as a company so that you can focus at least half of your time on these smaller use cases. The reality is if you try and shoot for 5 of them, 1 or 2 of them are for sure going to work. And you've already picked 5 that have some material impact on the company. The next time you go to drink at that well, you can justify something more, some bigger projects. Also, you're going to learn a lot about AI. You're going to learn about why did those 3 not work? What were the things we should have asked beforehand? So that your likelihood of success is much higher and you've de-risked the situation for whoever's investing in the project.
Yeah, and I think this is where that time allocation and time efficiency comes into play, because the next question kind of plays into that a little bit too. It's like, what are the best levers to fund and what are the greatest risks to fund, countermeasures or remediation against that? It comes down to what are you actually going to gain out of this? And in a lot of cases, it's going to be gaining time. The one that I've been looking at in terms of how we use our documentation, public, internal, whatever it is that we have, is that I want to make my subject matter experts less question answer people. Mm-hmm. When I think of this, hey, here's all the documentation that we have for this product, this service, this whatever, instead of saying, hey, what's the answer to this question that I have? Instead of IMing that person, here is a way for you to have a bot that knows effectively everything that person should know because it's all of the documentation that you have. This is a way to get your SMEs out of the spending time answering questions and focused on actually being the subject matter experts and actually going and solving problems. So there is an opportunity there, and you use that lever to fund that. I want to get more time out of my best people and not waste their time chasing around problems. But I think kind of in that same vein of like, how do I use time? How do I gain more efficiencies? That's the lever to go pull.
Yeah. So again, still early innings. And so the early use cases will be about efficiency gains. Be like, oh, we've saved this person 8 hours out of their month on a tedious task. But that's not where the long-term gain is. The thing is more, how do I use this to accelerate the strategy of my company vis-a-vis my competitors? And how do I integrate this knowledge that I have with AI and how it can reason and action so that I can accelerate the delivery of my product, the ability for me to sell, all of those types of things. But people get excited about those use cases because they can transform a business. They can vault you ahead of your competitors. But the reality is, before you implement those, there's a lot of what ifs that you have to go through, and a lot of eggshells that you need to break to get there. And so you're going to really focus on the kind of time pieces. So if you're kind of pulling together a budget for it, if it's a decently sized organization, your budget may be a couple $1,000,000 a year. That budget should be focused on implementing a few use cases. But even before that, the budget of the organization shouldn't be on the use cases. It should be, how do we get our people competent in understanding AI widely? They're subject matter experts in all areas of the business. If each one of those can be taught to fish, they'll be fed for their lifetime. And that's what the goal for, if you don't have that in place, that's budget item number one. Once those use cases, hey, we can make this improvement here, that's when kind of the next set of budgets, let's take some longer term investments. But the really long-term investment is, how do we unlock the power of the data that we have in our company to tell us how we should change and improve? The actual answers are already there. We just don't know how to ask the questions, and we don't have an oracle that we can ask. We're going to build those things. But I've built a bunch of companies, and I've found that my customers have always told me what I need to do to be more successful. It didn't come from me. I had some ideas, and they usually were wrong, but it was those customers and that data that came back from them telling me, please build this, please build that. I don't like this. This doesn't work for me. If you can listen to that, and AI gives you an ability to listen widely across all of your customers, wow, I mean, that's the real transformative value. But to get there, let's save time. Let's be more efficient. Let's teach people how to fish, and then move to those transformative applications.
So we have time for two more questions here. The first one here is pizza. This was an actual question. I'm not kidding. This is a real question. The answer is, it's good.
That is true.
Yeah, I'll just take that one. We don't need a full answer. And finally, our last question is actually, what is the best approach to getting started? We've spent the last 57 minutes here talking through the various ways to get started. But for you to get started, you can go to go.expedient.com/AI-success-kit, or you can scan this QR code right over there to get access to an AI success kit. This allows you to see what we're reading, but also get access to a policy that we wrote. Like, here's an acceptable use policy that you can use inside your company, because we want to help accelerate your organization based on what we've learned inside of ours. So you can scan that QR code to get access to our AI success kit. There's also a link in the chat that you can go to and click on and get access to that. Get in, read through it, and see what we're actually going for. We want to see where AI goes next. We want to help you get there. And we want to thank you all for your time. Brad, thank you so much for your time today.
Thanks, AJ.
And we will see you next time. Thanks, everybody.